doing my best to learn about Islam. And it took me to, my desire to study took me to Egypt, where I studied Islamic law. After studying law for a number of years, I came back and was an imam in Southern California, and quickly realized the challenges of having an engineering mindset and a legal mindset when you're dealing with community members. That it's a very different world of when, Jazakallahukhairan, Allah yabarak fik, using your logic, using kind of your intellectual faculties all the time to solve problems. And of course, if you're married, that doesn't always work very well either. That's a joke. And so it took me to graduate school, where I studied psychology, especially in educational context, as my interest was in trying to understand how to educate people about Islam, and realizing that simply kind of just shoving information down people's throats doesn't really work well. There's a whole lot of other factors that are involved in transforming the hearts and transforming the minds. About 7 or 8 years ago, a brother approached me in the community. His name is Dr. Hassan Alwan. Some of you might have heard of him or heard his speeches. He approached me and he said, Osman, he said, he's also an engineer, PhD, computer chip designer. He said, I just realized so many of the times that I speak to people and I am unpacking kind of what's happening in their life, giving them advice, a lot of it seems to be that they just have this really strange understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So he goes, can we study this? Can we begin to investigate this using at that time I was studying statistics, especially in graduate school. Jazakallahukhairan. Thank you so much, brother. Yeah. And so this is a 7-year project in the making that only in the last few months we've been publishing some of the papers at Yaqeen, where I work full-time now, and also part of my research at the University of California, Irvine, where I teach. So this is based on really almost close to a decade of reflection over how sometimes when we make things very legal and rational, right, it has the unintended consequences. And so I want to begin, I remember about a year ago, who remembers when the James Webb Telescope came out? Anybody? Right, some of you? Have any of you seen the pictures from the telescope? Right? It was fascinating for all human beings especially, because what it made us realize was that there was a world that we cannot see, that we know exists, and now there's technology that allows us to get a glimpse into it. And of course it's infrared, it's not something that our eyes can actually see, but using technology they can transform those infrared waves into light waves that are within our spectrum, right? It's a whole process. The point is, we were able to look, and for the believer to say, subhanAllah, look at the complexities, look at the beauty, look at just how fascinating it was. And I remember, at least for me, it was very awe-inspiring. And as a child, you always look up into the sky and you say, what's out there? And everything just looks black with some specks, and now there's something to fill in those details. And it got me thinking a lot, and as we were doing this research, about we don't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we didn't see the galaxy one day, and then we saw it the next day, and it filled in a lot of gaps. Oh, that's what it looks like. Even though it's not really what it looks like, still it gave us some idea. And I thought about this, that, well, every single human being, they are trying to figure out who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He is. They know He's there. They know He's real, especially for the believer. But kind of, who is He? Is a very elusive question to so many hearts and so many minds. And that really, this question of who is Allah, every single person in this life, Muslim or non-Muslim, atheist, makes no difference, will have to answer. And one of the fascinating researchers in this field, she was a woman who was doing a lot of work in clinical psychology, and she said that in her interviews with even people who don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she was a Christian psychologist, she would talk to these patients and ask them questions about, tell me what you think about the world and where do you come from, and she's trying to understand their problems. And so many of them, she would say, would start speaking about God, and they're atheist. And this is what they would say, not something good. They'd say, I don't like my life, I have a lot of issues in my life. Just God is just so mean, and God is just so cruel. And she's thinking about, and the person's saying, yeah, and I don't believe in God, right? And it's like, wait a minute. You clearly have some beliefs about the divine. Those beliefs are terrible and disgusting, and thus you kind of rationally reject them. It makes sense to reject a God like you're depicting. But she said she could not escape that these people consistently would mention that even though they're atheists, they have some idea of who God is. Even if you ask non-Muslims today, even who claim that they don't believe in God, tell me what do you think about God? They won't simply say, well, He doesn't exist. Many of them will say, well, at least we, if there's a God, he is like this and he is like this. And so they conjecture what he must be like, and because that definition of who he is not to their liking, they choose to reject him. And so she mentions this is a psychodynamic impossibility, meaning it's psychologically impossible for someone to never have to answer the question of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, or she says God. And so this really got us reflecting and thinking, okay, Allah in the Quran describes himself, he's al-Zahir, he's al-Batin, meaning he's apparent in some ways, and he's kind of unseen in some other ways, right? Meaning you can see his signs, you see elements that tell you that Allah exists. You see harmony in the creation, you see his beauty in his creation, you see so many things that give you in your fitrah this understanding of Allah, but then you can't get that real vision of who he is. As our eyes cannot perceive him, لا تدرك الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. Vision cannot perceive him, but his vision perceives all. Which is why when Musa alayhi salam even asked Allah, oh Allah, like show me a little bit about your glory, your beauty, your nur, and his eyes couldn't handle it, right? Even when a little bit of light struck the mountain and he saw it, he collapsed, right? So it's something we as human beings have not been created with a capacity. We don't have, we can't see certain rays that exist, light waves. We can't, of course, see the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so at the end of the day, despite the fact we can't see it, we will answer these questions for ourselves. Young and old, your children, every day. If you're a teenager, every day. Even if you're a young adult or older adult, you are constantly updating who you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. How do you do this? This is really the talk of today. How do you come to understand who Allah is? Contrary to what people think, it's not simply through being told in a lecture, right? We believe that there's two predominant ways of understanding who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. The first is what you can say a set of cognitive beliefs about who Allah is. Meaning something rational, it's something intellectual, it's something fact-based. And the proof of this is that if you ask any person who's gone to Sunday school, and you've talked to any Muslim who's ever taken classes in Islamic studies, they'll be able to give you an answer, and they'll say, well, we learned that Allah is, and you fill in the blank. And I do this all the time. Whenever I go to a youth camp, I did it last year, I had 150 teenagers, and I said to them, tell me the first 2 or 3 adjectives that come into your mind when you think about Allah. And you go around the room and you get them. You say, creator, powerful, right? The one, right? The list goes on and on. And one of the things that we noticed was that all of those things they're saying, right, are typically like they're in one domain of who Allah is. And that is the domain of his jalal, right? The domain of his majesty, his lordship, right? He is the creator. He's the one who's in control, right? He's the one who's sovereign, right? He's the one who's the most powerful. And you almost never hear, when someone says, when they're asked a question, who is Allah? They'll say, the kind, the intimate, right? The compassionate, right? The near. Sometimes they'll say mercy because this Ar-Rahman is a name that everyone knows. But I notice this distinction, that why is it there's such an emphasis in people's hearts and minds about him being this powerful deity, and so little about the attributes of Allah that relate to how we interact with him. And this gets me to the second point. And so the first dimension of how we learn, or the first aspect of our knowledge of Allah, comes from kind of this cognitive beliefs we absorb. We get it from our parents that tell us Allah is, and every parent has done this. They tell their children, Allah is one, right? And the kid says, Allah is one, right? And then they say that Allah created the universe, right? He's Al-Khaliq. And they say, yes, He's Al-Khaliq, right? And so the kids, they take this. And then they go to Sunday school and they hear some of these things as well. And then they might listen to some lectures. So they absorb this intellectually. But the second domain is actually what we're finding to be the far more powerful and influential in how you live your life. And that is what you can call as the affective experiential domain. Fancy way for seeing your emotional knowledge of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And this is more along the lines of if I ask somebody, how do you feel about Allah? And they'll say, well, I don't feel His nearness, right? Or I don't feel His compassion. I don't feel His kindness. But that feeling reflects kind of how you imagine Him to be. I'll give you an example. If somebody has, and we'll talk a lot about parents, but think about your own mom and your dad. And if I asked you to describe for me your mom and your dad, like in a couple of words or a few sentences, I'm sure people will have a few dominant expressions out there. my mom is incredibly sweet and gentle and kind, or my father, he's very kind, but he's very strict, right? Everyone has come up with a few catchphrases that can describe their parents. Now, the truth is that most of you didn't learn this because your parents told you, this is who I am, right? Your mom didn't come to you and say, sweetie, I'm really sweet and gentle and kind, right? And your dad didn't say, you know, I'm very strict, right? And by the rules. You learned this through your experiences. Oh, my mom just spoke to me kindly. My mom just forgave me for my mistake. Oh, my dad, you know, just was very strict with me in the circle. Whatever the issue is, you're absorbing every single day through your experiences. You attach an emotion to it. Then you come up with a definition of, well, my mom or my dad is like this. What's fascinating is that we do something very similar in understanding who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He is. So take these two different domains, intellectual, rational stuff, and then this emotional, affective stuff. And to give, again, some examples, is that people begin to attach meaning to everything that happens in their life. Even non-Muslims do it superstitiously. Some of you might be fans of sports, right? And sports fans do this all the time. Or if you play a sport. You play a sport or you're watching the sport and you're wearing a certain shirt that day, right? And your team wins. Ah, my lucky shirt, right? Now I wear my lucky shirt every time, right? The Lakers play, because last time they wore it, right? The Lakers won, so if I wear it again, they're going to win, right? So we do this as human beings. We just have this propensity to kind of attach this kind of meaning to, it's like a metaphysical meaning to kind of mundane events in the world. But again, we do it also with Allah. And so we try to make sense out of why does Allah do things to us. So, okay, I got sick, right? Or He gave me wealth. Or my marriage did not work out. Anything that happens to you, people try and say, why was Allah doing this? And that is the question of today we want to answer, is why do people give a broad range of answers from, for instance, well, I lost my job, or I did not get this job. And one perception could be, Allah is so kind and He's so wise. He knows what job is good for me. And even though I wanted this job badly, that's not where my rizq was, and that's not where khair for me was, and so Allah turned me away from it. That's a pretty high level of iman to be at. Most people will say, why didn't I get this job? I deserve this job. Maybe it's because I'm brown, right? Maybe it's because of this. We'll try to find a reason why we didn't get the job, and that's at the dunya level. And then at the divine level, we might say things like, well, you know what, maybe Allah is punishing me, or why is Allah not giving this to me? And so you say, why do we have these wide range of experiences? And it is because just like you absorbed an understanding of your parents by kind of what they did to you, you begin to absorb an understanding of who Allah is through each experience you inhale and exhale every single day, right? So you inhale an experience, you exhale a belief. This happened to me, this is what it means. This happened to me, this is what it means. And over and over and over. And what I want to speak at length for today, which is the role of parents in all of this. Because no parent teaches their child ever that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mean, or that He's cruel, or He's harsh. Yet somehow, so many children and young adults absorb, and they will say in one way or another that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is either cold or distant or harsh or mean or demanding and so on and so forth. You say, why? How did this happen? And we can start with the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, "Kullun mawludun al-fitra." Right? He says, every single child is born on the fitrah. مَا مِن مَوْلُودٍ إِلَّا يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. Right? Not one human being is born except they're born on the natural disposition. That natural disposition, which is what? To believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Prophet continues, but then his parents come and they يُهَوِّدَانِهِ أو يُمَجِّسَانِهِ أو يُنَصِّرَانِهِ to the end of the hadith. And he says, then it's the parents who will teach their kids that Allah is three, and they turn him into a Christian, or Allah is this, they turn him into a Jew, or Allah is that, and they turn him into a Magian or a fire worshiper. Whatever it is, the parents transmit the belief about who Allah is. Sometimes we stop at this hadith and we say, well, we don't do that. We, Muslim parents and imams and Sunday school teachers and other adults who teach children about faith would never do such a thing. We only reinforce what Allah says in the Quran. And all those beautiful names and attributes, Alimul Ghaybi wa Shahada, Al-Malik Al-Quddus As-Salam. We say all these things, right? And here, what I want us to think about in this hadith is that this hadith is not Sometimes we think that it's only speaking about what we explicitly tell our kids. But it can also refer to the experiences we have with our children that superimpose or imprint an image of who Allah is on our children's hearts. And this is really what we find in our research especially, is that the children will end up absorbing a default understanding of who Allah is based on how they view their parents. It's a very scary and empowering idea. I'm going to repeat this again. Children, what they end up doing is that they see Allah is abstract to children. So you ask a 3-year-old, who is Allah? They cannot really understand. They can say Allah because we've told them to say Allah. They can say, the expressions we want. They can say the shahada, but they don't understand the abstract. They don't have the intellectual capability of understanding the abstract. So in the absence of understanding that, Allah has created means in this dunya, right? You know what? Allah is ar-razaq, right? The sustainer. But Allah doesn't, directly feed you. Allah doesn't directly give you your paycheck. He does it through other means in the universe. So it could be through, your parents, that as a child you are being fed and you're being nourished. So the risk from Allah comes through mom and dad. Or the risk from Allah comes through your employer and as you get older. So we understand this as adults, that between Allah and what He is giving us, there are oftentimes, otherworldly means. But children, they don't understand this. And so children have a propensity that when they are asked about, tell me about your parents, and you ask about mom and you ask about dad, and then you say, well, tell me about Allah, that there is usually a correlation between the two of these. So however they view mom and dad, if mom is incredibly nice, kind, loving, and dad is incredibly nice, kind, and loving, and you say, tell me who Allah is, they're likely to say He's nice and He's kind and He's loving. And if they say that my dad and my mom are really strict and harsh and punishing, then they're more likely to say that Allah is strict and harsh and punishing. And it's fascinating, and like I said, it is terrifying for a parent, because no parent taught their kids that. And so we come back to, how did they learn this? And there's a theory I want to speak for a few minutes about. It's called attachment theory. If anyone has studied psychology, they might know about this. And the idea is that a child will begin to understand relationships in life, will begin to understand how to interact with others based on how they interacted with their parents in their early years of life. So if the mother and the father were very supportive, accessible, fulfilling the needs of the kid, consistently there for the child, they form what's called a secure attachment, which means the kid feels secure in the presence of mom and dad, right? They're able to venture away from mom and dad, and when they get scared, they can go back to mom and dad. You've probably all seen it. If you put a toddler, and the toddler is sitting next to mom and dad, even in the masjid, maybe the toddler will start to roam off, and when he gets a little too far for comfort, he wants to run back to his mom and his dad. That is a secure attachment, right? They know that the mom and dad is a secure base, right? They know they're comfortable with mom and dad, and they know that mom and dad give them the space to venture off and they can come back. But for many kids, they don't learn this. Unfortunately, a non-trivial portion of children form what's called an anxious attachment, or even an avoidant attachment, which is when mom and dad are inconsistent with their children, which means that if mom and dad are busy with work and the kid comes and says, Mom, I'm hungry, or Mom, I don't feel well, or Mom, I'm thirsty, mom or dad might say, you know what, I'm busy, go take care of yourself, right? And really from work from home, I worry about kind of how this has changed. I say that as a father, right, who's working from home a lot, and if I was working in an office, my children don't come to me and ask me for things. But when I'm sitting at home and they keep knocking my door and I have a meeting and I'm in the middle of doing my work, it's much more likely for me to say, hey, don't bother me right now, I'm busy. But what happens if kids repeatedly or inconsistently get their needs being met? Well, sometimes I go to mom, sometimes she gives me what I need. Sometimes I go to mom, right, sometimes she's not there for me. Sometimes I go to dad, and this inconsistently creates this anxiety in the kid. Essentially, it says that they create in their heart what's called an internal working model, right? That's a fancy word for it, which means I have a default way of dealing with people I've learned. And they use this with everything else in life. It's actually surprising that even the way you deal with your spouse is likely similar to how you learned your relationship with your mom and your dad. So if you're anxious with your mom and your dad, you're likely going to be anxious in your relationship with your spouse. If you're avoidant with your mom and your dad, which meant your mom and your dad never had time for you and they were kind of just made you grow up on your own, the human being typically says, I don't need anyone else's love. I have to be self-sufficient. So even in a relationship with a wife or with a husband or wife might be like, I don't want to get too intimately close to my spouse and open up because I don't want to get burned, because I know that feeling. Again, it's not something which they're calculating, it's just something that's being programmed into them. And so they'll keep that distance. And spouses might often wonder, why does my husband never open up to me? Or why does my wife never open up to me? We've been married for a decade. Well, there's a default of how that person has learned to interact with people. And that applies to their good friends, right? It applies to other relationships. So coming back to all of this is that we as Muslims, the goal is to have this deep, intimate relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet for so many people it's difficult. And then you go back to why. And sometimes that why is because, I'm not blaming parents here at all, that's not my point, but they have set into motion a way of thinking about how should I interact with Allah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the same words in the Quran. If you think about it, even the word Rabb, right? The Lord. Allah even talks about the father, right? Even talks about the parents, like, as you say, Rabbul Bayt, right? Or we use the word tarbiyah, right? Talk about nurturing our children. So there's a connection even between the word of Rabb and the Lord and the responsibility of parents to nurture children. And so children, you are essentially nurturing in your kid's heart every single day an orientation of who Allah is. And that makes me stop now and say, well, what do parents do? Knowingly and unknowingly. The knowingly one is easy. It's that when we tell our kids the cognitive side, son, let me tell you about Allah today, and you tell them a little bit about, Allah created the universe, right? He's powerful, He's in control of things, He's kind, and He's merciful. And you can say all the right words. But that is a very small element actually of what kids will end up coming to see and imagine Allah has. What will end up happening is, it's that day by day, what do you do with them? Do they see that when you speak about God, that the emotions match? So I'll give you some examples. We have something, you can call it a number of different terms, but it can be vicarious learning, right? It can be all kinds of different models. So think about when in your life, as a parent, you invoke the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the presence of your kids. I know for some parents, especially with auto parents, probably more dominant. So if you're an auto parent, you might understand this more. When your kid does something wrong, you go to your child, and before you tell them they did something wrong, you say, Wallahi, and then you continue with what you're going to tell them, right? Wallahi, you're not going to go out with your friends tonight, right? They've done something wrong, right? Now, yes, Arabs smiling, some of you kind of get this, right? Desis don't say this as much, right? They have their own issues, so we'll... But I want us to appreciate, we as human beings start to form associations. So I'll give you an example before I go back to this. If I say the word ice cream, look at his eyes. This kid's eyes just got enormous, right? Right? Why do you feel that way when I say the word ice cream? You're not eating ice cream. If I gave you a scoop, I could see why you get happy. But why when I said the word ice cream, you got excited? Because you have built over the last 10, 20, 30 years an association that when I take a lick out of ice cream, it feels good. And I enjoy it, and I eat it again and again and again and again. And so now when I hear the word ice cream, the emotions associated with ice cream pop into my mind, right? Now, I'm assuming you've had good ice cream in your life, right? Ice cream is, you have good sweet chocolate, right? You have vanilla, you have all these wonderful flavors, right? But what if I had a child in an alternative world, and I started feeding him ice cream as a kid, but it was like masala ice cream, right? I said, son, you want ice cream? And I say, here, this is like masala ice cream. And he's eating it, he licks a lick, and he's like, disgusting, right? What's going to happen over now if he's 15 years old and someone says ice cream? What is he probably going to do? He's going to have an aversive reaction. He's like, I don't want to hear about ice cream, right? Don't talk about ice cream. It brings up all kinds of horrible images in my mind and flavors and emotions, and these come oozing out of their, all their senses, right? So we understand that with like the dunya. We get it. Okay, say it about ice cream, say it about something else. But when parents now, you're coming back to Allah, and now the kid is learning every time the name of God is mentioned, something bad is about to go down. What do they make an association? Obviously, it's not Allah who's punishing them. It's the parent. But they have simply created an association in their mind. Allah, anger. Allah, punishment. Right? Allah, trouble. Right? And so then you wonder when they're 16, 17, 18 years old, and the kid, you want them to be religious and practicing, that the kid is like, I don't want I don't want this. It's not that like and they can't really articulate why. It's just this absorbed thing, just like the ice cream, right? And then you have the opposite, where, if a parent, how often, and by the way, let's be honest, this is not uncommon. It's not uncommon for parents to invoke the name of God, right, when they're angry, right? It's just something which culturally that we do. And we don't realize that it rubs off, right? And it has that effect on the child. And coming back to even issues of motivation, right? We talk about another, or I'll even continue on that line. Forget just what's happening next. What about when you invoke the name of Allah? What's your facial expression like? So if it's like, Wallahi, right? There's a frown, and the kid is again interpreting, whether they don't sense it. God, mom's face is mad, right? Mom's face is angry. Dad's face is angry, right? And it's so subtle, but this is happening thousands and thousands of times from when they're a little kid to they grow up. And lo and behold, one day, again, all these negative associations. And imagine how different that is than a parent who every time they invoke the name of Allah, right, they're smiling, right? Or they're happy, right? Or something good is going to happen, right? Now they're beginning to create this positive association with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is just one thing to think about for parents. Think about, you are shaping your kids' understanding of who God is through these daily mundane events, especially when you invoke the name of Allah. It's your emotions, it's your tone, it's your facial expressions, it's what happens afterwards. All this is part of this event where the kid has now said, I've experienced God in this way. So let's put that to the side for a minute. Now we go to the other side when it comes to how we want to encourage and motivate our kids to do good things. Every parent who's practicing Muslim, their goal is that their kids obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the desire to make our kids obey Allah makes us enact certain ways of parenting. Now, moving from attachment theories more to parenting theories, right? And typically, for religious parents who are trying to pass on the faith, parents are going to have demands on their kids, meaning I expect you to do certain things. You have to pray, right? You have to fast. We don't say, pray if you feel like praying. Read Quran if you want to read Quran, right? Go and do, we don't do that. We typically say you need to be doing these things, and we hold our children over time as they get older and older to these expectations. But here's the kicker, is what do you use to motivate your kid to do what you need them to do? Because again, the goal here is you want to convey that Allah is in control of the universe. Allah owns the universe. Allah has created us to worship Him, and so we have things we need to do, right? He chooses to tell us what to do, and we have to obey it. And if now we go to our children, and we believe in our hearts that the way to motivate my kid is through threats and punishments. And some parents, they do this. This is called an authoritarian parent for the most part, right? Which means that they have a lot of demands on their kids, and they kind of are low and they're not very warm and emotionally connected. It's more of like, don't ask questions, do what I tell you to do. And if you don't do it, there's punishments, right? And so now imagine that you want to tell your kid to pray. All right, son, it's time for Maghrib, go and pray. And if you have a child like any of my children, right, I have one teenager, and the younger ones, at least my teenager, is like, nothing happens the first time you ask, right? And then you ask the second time, she's still reading the book, right? You might ask the third time, and then she might say, I didn't hear you, right? And as a parent, you get frustrated. You're like, it's time to go and pray. And so a parent has a choice of what the levers they can pull. One lever that parents often pull is, you need to pray. If missing prayer is haram. And if you miss your prayer, right, Allah can punish you, right? And if you miss prayers, right, Allah can put you in hell. So something along those lines where you're slowly, again, using threats and punishments, again, with a good intention. The intention is really noble. I want my kid to get up and pray. But when I asked nicely, they didn't do it. So now I've got to escalate. And I now say, if you don't do it, Allah's going to punish you. And if you don't do it, right? And don't you know, like the people, Allah says in the Quran, that, woe to those who don't pray, right? People in Jahannam, right? Those are the people who didn't pray. And so now, again, I'm not saying here that there's no room in Islam to ever talk about punishment and fear. That's not my point. I'll come back to this. But again, is your method of motivating your child a method that is using the stick? Do this or else. Do this or else. I'll be mad at you, Allah will be mad at you. Allah will punish you, I will punish you. And again, it creates that association. God is demanding, God is quick to punish, right? God doesn't give me any freedom in my life. And then again, you see that desire as they get older to kind of disassociate from that. Versus a very different way, which is, okay, I asked you once, asked you twice, asked you thrice, it's not working. Please, it's time to pray. Don't you know Allah loves those who pray? Don't you know that Allah rewards people tremendously? He appreciates your salah, right? It's a whole different world. This is a world of now, Allah likes it, He enjoys it, and now the act of prayer or the encouragement for prayer is tied with positive things. I'm not saying it'll always work. Sometimes it'll work. But again, now the kid associates these behaviors are associated with good outcomes. Happiness of my Lord, satisfaction of my Lord, His appreciation, right? Ajr, right? Paradise. And so now again, a parent has to pick, are they going to do A or are they going to do B? Now here's what gets even more interesting. The way that you think Allah is as a parent, and this is a paper we'll be publishing in 2 weeks, inshallah. The way that a parent, we asked parents, 700 parents, a bunch of questions about who is Allah. Those parents who perceive Allah as harsh report themselves using harsh parenting and report themselves using punishment and threats as a way to get their kids to comply with their demands. So the parents are pretty clear. They don't realize it, but they admitted essentially that those of us who think that Allah is not kind, benevolent, caring, easily forgiving, we're going to use harsher parenting with our kids. Again, these questions were unrelated. It was just general parenting and then your religious views. And then children, we asked these kids, adolescents and young adults, tell me what do you think about your parents' parenting? Nothing about religion. Are they warm? Are they kind? Are they compassionate? Right? Are they strict? Are they punishing? All these things. And those kids who saw their parents as authoritarian, incredibly strict and harsh, were more likely to internalize that Allah is strict and He's harsh. And those kids were very likely to have religious doubts and difficulty submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning we'd ask them questions like, how difficult do you find it to do something when you don't understand the wisdom? Right? If you don't know why God asked you to do it, right? And they would say, yeah, we don't want to do things unless we understand why. Or how upset do you get when things happen to you that you don't understand the wisdom? So the act of submission, right, is lacking in those children who are raised in this fashion. So I want us to bring this together and say, okay, like what do we do as parents? What do we do as parents? Number one, as parents, we really have to think hard about rehabilitating our own understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Because we are the products of our parents and our societies and our cultures, right? And I spoke earlier in the Jummah today, and also that whatever pop culture we were exposed to, right, shaped the way we thought about God. And our children, they're also exposed to this all the time. I spoke about in the Jummah, right? Marvel movies is an example. I'm sure many youth watch Marvel movies. And in Marvel, they are very explicit now that God is typically the bad guy in the movie. And those who've watched it know what I'm speaking about, right? That in each of these last few movies that come out, it's like, here's the bad guy. He seems to be good. He's a powerful God, but deep down he's really evil and he's bad. And so imagine you're just watching these movies and you're thinking nothing about it. But lo and behold, you wake up and you're like, well, through my parents are harsh to me. These movies tell me God is demanding. And then you see why Islam or religion in the West and belief in God is continuing and drop and drop and drop and drop. So as parents, the first and foremost thing we need to do is recognize that our relationship, we are relational human beings. We transmit who Allah is, not through what we say to our children about Allah, through what we do with our children. Actions speak louder than words. So if we act kind and we act forgiving and if we're gentle and all those positive attributes, that ultimately those are attributes of Allah, right? This is called at-takhalluq bi asma'illah. We embody, right? And we try to imitate those attributes of Allah that He has told us to try and embody. The generosity, the kindness, the forgiveness. And if we do that, that's the number one way of rehabilitating, not only of fixing and shaping your kids' positive understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He is. Number two, the issue of warmth and kindness cannot be underestimated. Is that when people think about the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have to actually look at his seerah and investigate how did he shape how people saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you look, you'll find some tremendous stories, we'll speak about a few of those today, of how his personal, because again, he is essentially the Khalifa, he's the Prophet of Allah who's essentially through his behaviors, people are learning about who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So if the Prophet is gentle and he's merciful, then of course Allah is more merciful. Right? If the Prophet is kind, then of course Allah is more kind. And this is why if the Prophet is rahmatan lil alameen, mercy to mankind, right? Of course Allah is ar-Rahman. So ar-Rahman sent rahmatan lil alameen to us. And so you stop and you reflect over how the Prophet dealt with the companions, and that gives you, for you as a parent, a model of how to work with your children. Because I know that out of our concern for our kids, it's easy to default to being strict and harsh. And so I'll give you a couple examples. One example is a man, he came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is in Ramadan, and the Prophet had a group of companions together. And this man comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he says, Ya Rasulullah, I'm ruined, I'm done for. And he says, what happened? He said, I broke my fast in Ramadan, right? He broke his fast because of a relation with his wife. And so the Prophet asked him, well, can you free a slave, right, to make atonement for this, right? And he said that, no, I can't, right? And I'm broke, essentially, right? He said, can you fast for 2 consecutive months? He says, Ya Rasulullah, I couldn't last a day in Ramadan when we do 2 months, right? And then he said, okay, can you feed 60 poor people? He said, Ya Rasulullah, I'm so poor, I don't have any money to feed poor people. He said, okay, take a seat. And he's in the gathering with his companions, and after some time, somebody comes to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he gives him a basket of dates and gives him some food. And he says, hey, where's that man who came to ask the question? The man, he gets up. And he tells the man, okay, you know what? Take these dates and go and distribute it to the poor. And the man says, Ya Rasulullah, I don't know a man poorer in the streets of Medina than me. And the Prophet, he smiles and he says, okay, take these and go and feed your family, right? Now, I just want you to imagine you're sitting there in the presence of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and a man came and he sinned. He broke a fast in Ramadan. But he was remorseful, keep this in mind, right? That's why he came and he asked, for a way out, essentially. And the Prophet gave him a way out, but he kept on saying, oh, it's so hard, it's so hard, it's so hard, right? Ultimately, the Prophet said, just go home and feed your family, right? And he was done with the affair. If you're sitting there, you say, this is the messenger of God. If this is how he treats people, how will my Lord treat me, right? And so he's modeling rahmah. And he's modeling for them to understand your Lord is even more merciful than this, right? Another time a man comes, a teenager, this is on the day of Yawm al-Nahr, right? Day of Eid al-Adha. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the day of Eid, all the tribes from outside of Medina, they would come into Medina, right? And they would have, of course, Eid together. And so the Prophet he would be sitting on his camel, and people would come to him from the tribes, and a huge line of people. Imagine you don't get a chance to meet the Prophet regularly, ﷺ, and now you have a chance to go and ask him any question you want. So there's a line of people who are asking him questions. So he's sitting on his camel, and behind him is his cousin, who at this time was a young man. His name was Fadl ibn Abbas, the brother of Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiyallahu anhuma. So a young man, and imagine he's sitting behind him, just like my Gatorade is behind me, and the Prophet is taking these questions, and after a questioner comes, a sister comes and asks a question. And it's a beautiful sister. And so the companion who's sitting behind, his cousin, starts to stare at the young woman who's asking the question, right? And when I hear this hadith, I always go back to thinking, like, what would most people tell a child or someone in the masjid or something like that if they're, imagine you're in the masjid and the kid is looking at a phone and looking at an inappropriate photo, right? Or staring at a sister in the masjid, taqillah, like you find some way to kind of probably, it's like this is inappropriate, right? Right? The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? He's talking to this young woman, answering her question, and as he's answering a question, right? He's giving revelation, right? He knows what this guy is doing, right? He just turns as he's answering. He takes the chin of Fadl and he just turns it to the side, right? And he just keeps on talking, right? No scolding, no yelling, right? No fighting, no shaming, right? The kid got the message, right? This is not inappropriate behavior, right? But again, the point is, it's not that he's ignoring evil. This is not the messenger of Allah. Nahi and munkar is a part of Islam, right? It's necessary that we speak out and we correct evil. But it's how is he doing it? He's always trying to do it in a way that is never shaming anybody, right? That is not destroying their sense of self. And this is what happens when we find you guilt people over and over and over. You miss prayer, you're a bad Muslim, right? You didn't do this, right? You're a bad person. This harsh form of parenting creates a sense of shame. And again, in our same study, we found this exact thing. People end up internalizing that they are not lovable. And if a child learns that they are not lovable, they don't just think about not being lovable to their parents and to people. They actually internalize this when it comes to Allah. And so when you ask them about the relationship with Allah, you find this anxiousness that I view Allah positively, but I think terribly of myself. And so I'm just so anxious and unsettled that I don't think God will ever accept me, right? And that is not going to propel them to rush and get closer and closer to Him. So I know I've been speaking for a while, but I want to stop just for a few minutes, ask some questions, and we'll come back to some of these points, inshallah. So questions, sisters or brothers? Or quiz time? Everyone has it figured out? Now you know how to go home, what to do with your kids, right? Yes? Alaikum salam. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Jazakumullah khair. So to answer your question, first, there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ where he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, hadith Qudsi, he said, Ana inda dhanni abdi bi. He said, I am as my servant perceives me to be. Which is a way that Allah is telling us that you will see me, like, in other words, the way that you've internalized who I am, you will see that manifested in the world. And I'll give you some fascinating stuff when we did during COVID. First, 15 days of quarantine, we did a global study actually. And we asked people about do you see blessings that are out there during the pandemic? This is pre-pandemic, it's just socialized, it was just quarantine, right? Social distancing. And there was people who would be like, I see no blessings, right? Those people who saw no blessings, they were the ones who had the worst mental health. They're the ones who had the most maladaptive coping. They'd go do the hoarding of things. They'd start binging the news. They would start sanitizing everything 100 times. And they had really, really bad mental health. And really, it stemmed from the fact is, what did they see of the world? If they saw doom and gloom, right, their behaviors and their coping manifested that. So when you tell me what you read, again, I don't want to read too much into this, but a lot of it comes back to who do we think Allah is, and then what do we read into their script? I'll give you an example. When you deal with a person, if I know you, and my knowledge or my perception of you is that you're a passive-aggressive person. When you're speaking to me, I'm almost like looking for that passive-aggressiveness, or I might interpret something that is neutral as being passive-aggressive, because that's just my default of thinking about who you are. And so that has kind of skewed my interpretation of your statement. So in this regard, it may be that if somebody has a propensity, right, to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as harsh and punishing, those ayat about it pop out to them, and you might even overinflate their value. But I will come back to it because you're right. The Quran is a book that gives us, if we talk about it, the names of Allah. When He mentions His name of Rahman, Rahim, and Ghafoor, and these names are the most dominant in the Quran. They come 300-400 times if you add them together. And if you talk about the names of Allah or situations about punishment, they're actually way fewer. But keep something in mind, that sometimes mentioning something once, if it's intense, can seem like it's way more frequent than if it's something that, than something else. So one of the ways that I think we should think about this is, number one, when Allah mentions His punishment and His wrath, who is He speaking about in the Quran? Or when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ speaks about Allah's punishment and wrath, which is real, who is He speaking about? Do you find the Messenger of Allah ﷺ saying that the Muslim who is trying his best, and he does everything in his power, and he falls short sometimes, and he misses a prayer here, right, or he commits a sin there, Allah is going to throw this person in the deepest depths of hellfire? No, you don't see that. You see when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is talking about His punishment, He is overwhelmingly speaking about people who are with complete knowledge, rejecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who know the truth and are fighting against His message knowingly. It's not, I'm weak, I have a shortcoming, my desires got the best of me. It's, I don't care what God is telling me to do. I know what He's saying is the truth, I will fight it. And I'll give you from the seerah some perspective of this. Because people say, what? Allah is so harsh with some of the people in the seerah. Look at how He drove out, right, some of the tribes, right, in Bani Nadir, huwa alladhi akhraja alladhina kafaru min ahli al-kitabi, right, Bani Nadir, how He expelled them, right, or the Jews of Bani Qurayza, right, or Quraysh. What is their reality? I mean, I want you to appreciate this because I think today we don't understand it because we don't get revelation today. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is in Medina. And Ka'b ibn Ashraf, the leader of one of the Jewish tribes, goes to Quraysh in Mecca and they conspire to kill the Messenger of Allah. Allah gives the Prophet ﷺ revelation that this conversation is happening in Mecca and he's in Medina. And so, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has Ka'b ibn Ashraf assassinated by Muhammad ibn Maslama and a number of companions. It's a story for another day. But then the Jews of the tribe, they come to the Prophet and say, Ya Rasulullah, you killed our tribe's leader. There's an oath between us. And he tells them what? He said, you know. He said that you know what he was plotting against me and the companions. And the Jews are like, yeah, we know. So they know that the Prophet knew what their leader was up to in Mecca. They know that Allah is giving him revelation. And then they're still fighting him. And they're still killing companions. And they're still conspiring. These are the people who get that wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or in the Quran, it talks about the prior generations, right, who came. People of Ad, people of Thamud. Again, Allah sent them a prophet. They knew he was the truth. He brought them a miracle. And then he destroyed them when there was no chance of them believing. Keep this in mind. This is not Allah hunting out sincere people who make honest mistakes. Now, of course, we should never fall into what's called istidraj, which is you feel like, you know what, Allah will never punish me because I'm sincere and I'm good, right? You never know where your heart might turn. So the believer is always on guard, right? That's why the Prophet said, ﷺ, that whoever, like, you know, when if somebody, paraphrasing here, that the person who worries about hypocrisy, right, that's a person of iman, right? When we worry for ourselves of becoming hypocrites, that what we believe in is not what we do, right? That's a sign that you have faith. If you're like, you know, I'm good, nothing will ever happen to me, I'm secure, right? This is a sign possibly of delusion. So coming back, right? I hope I answered your question a bit, but coming back to how, oh, sister, you have a question? Go ahead. Yeah, Jazakallahukhairan. That's a wonderful question. The good news is that there's tremendous hope because none of these internal working models are fixed. People can, through a number of different mechanisms, change their attachment style. They can change their parenting style and change their understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Now, here's the difficult part. It doesn't happen by coming to a lecture. It doesn't. You might get like a snapshot of it, but again, you're getting simply the rational cognitive side of it. You're not getting the emotional experience. So what you need to do that, this is the hard part. The individual who's struggling has to form, one of the most powerful ways, is forming a relationship with a human being who can rehabilitate their internal working model. So in other words, this is why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, this was his role. He had adults he's working with, right? He doesn't have people with a blank slate and he's starting them off from infancy and teaching them who Allah is. He's dealing with people who had superstitious beliefs, all kinds of deviations in understanding who Allah is, and he's telling them stories, he's interacting with them, and so he's rehabilitating that day by day by day by day. Scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. They're not only supposed to speak about what Islam is, but they need to do it in their behavior. When you find, the responsibility on an individual is to find a human being, find a scholar, find a teacher, find a mentor, who through, you see them as someone who embodies the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And through a relationship with them, through joining a halaqah, through regular interactions, you will begin to recognize and see and fix, actually, you know what, I can trust people. You know what? Like in my anxiety, right, in my relationship with people, right, I can see that I'm worthy of love, right? I can see that I don't need to be avoidant anymore. And that's what the Prophet is doing day by day by day by day. And there's a story I'll even tell you about a teacher, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, the great scholar of Islam. His student, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he said, I learned so much from my teacher about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how helpful he is to humanity through seeing how my teacher would interact with the creation. So he said that his teacher would say, and always tell him the hadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always in the service of his creation, as long as they're in the service of others. So he says that my teacher was constantly going out and being in the service of others, and he would tell me that Allah is always facilitating for him as a consequence of it. So he internalized it, and he gave a story that was beautiful. He said that one of the enemies of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he passed away, who used to curse him and badmouth him and all these things, right? And so his student Ibn Qayyim goes to him and he's like celebrating. He's like, Shaykh, guess what? The guy that badmouths you all the time, he's dead, right? And his teacher saw that the student was happy and he rebuked him. He said, this is not appropriate. And he took him to the teacher's house and he went and he consoled the deceased and he told him that I want to be here for you at your time of your loss. If there's anything you need, right, I'll fill the role, right, that your father had played. And Ibn Qayyim mentions, he says that people used to say that we wish we could be as good to our friends as Ibn Taymiyyah is to his enemies, right? That's the level, right, of how you pick up, right, on human character. And you say, okay, this is someone who's representing God, right? Scholars and teachers who speak about Allah, they're representing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one way or another, right? This is why Ibn Qayyim wrote a book. He said, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'een. He said these are the scholars. It's a book for scholars. It's like, informing those who sign off on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that's what a scholar is doing. They are essentially signing off on what Allah thinks about this issue or that issue, right? So the difficulty here is that we are a generation that loves information through efficient means. We like YouTube, right? And I say this as someone who works at an online organization and recognizes this, that you cannot simply learn about who Allah is and rehabilitate yourself through listening to wonderful lectures from teachers you've never met. It will help. But you need to do it with a living, breathing human being. And that will not only fix your relationship with Allah, it will fix your relationship with your friends, with your spouse, with your children, and many other people. For your children, if you have struggled to be that pillar with that relationship, and it's normal, especially in adolescence, parents should not expect that during their kids' teenage years, that they're going to be able to have that warm, loving, consistent bond. Of course, you try your best, but adolescents by nature, they are trying to distance themselves from mom and dad. And parents have to recognize that it's nothing personal. It's not personal. This is actually part of development. And you have to facilitate for them. How can I put you in the company of people who will teach you about who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through their behavior before their words? And that's why Imam Malik, rahimahullah, his mother, right, used to be very mindful about this, right? And she said that go and learn. She took him to a specific scholar because of his character and his conduct. And so and Imam Malik spoke about this. He goes, there's so many people I could narrate from, but I don't narrate from them. He was very selective. He's like, people only whose inside understanding of Allah matches their outside understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll say a few things, and I know we're getting towards our time, to really appreciate the consequence of all of this. From the seerah, Allah actually mentions it in the Quran, in numerous places. Because the take home from this, I hope for everybody, is not just be a better parent, but it's also the influence on your life. Is that every aspect of your life, you're going to quickly interpret it based on that gut reaction of who is Allah. And I think the most vivid example of this I could find in the Quran is in Surah Al-Ahzab, in the chapter 33 about the Confederates, the Battle of the Ditch, where Allah tells us in the surah, not what happened in the surah. He doesn't give us the details. That's in the books of seerah. But what he tells us, and much of the Quran is like this, by the way, it's fascinating. When you read about the battles in the Quran, most of what Allah tells you is not the events that are happening outside. He's telling you what's happening in the minds of people who were in the battle. He tells you what's happening in the hearts of the believers, what their thoughts were, their emotions. He tells you what's in the minds of the hypocrites and the disbelievers. And it's a fascinating way of thinking about what Allah is trying to tell us and teach us about the battles. So he tells us in Surah Al-Ahzab, after first he mentions that this was a very severe incident, that even the believers, their hearts were shaken. وَتَظُنُّونَ بِاللَّهِ الظُّنُونَ. Even the believers started to have some unwholesome thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he mentions quickly how two different groups thought. He said, وَإِذْ يَقُولُ الْمُنَافِقُونَ وَالَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ إِلَّا غُرُورًا. He says, when those who have hypocrisy in their hearts or a disease in their hearts, meaning they're weak in their faith, hypocrites and those weak in their faith, when they saw the 10,000 people coming, there were 3,000 in Medina, 10,000 coming from outside. What was their knee-jerk, what was their gut reaction? Allah and His Messenger have lied to us. That's what they said. The Quran tells us, مَا وَعَدَنَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ إِلَّا غُرُورًا. This is not something which is rational and cold. It's a hot, immediate reaction. I see these enemies, man, God deluded us. The Messenger lied to us. We are through. He said that, that Allah would take care of us. And then the next page, and Allah goes more into what they're thinking about, but the next page, Allah says, وَلَمَّا رَأَى الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الْأَحْزَابَ. And when the believers who have real iman in their heart, meaning they understood Allah the way He's meant to be understood, what did they say? وَلَمَّا رَأَى الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الْأَحْزَابَ قَالُوا هَذَا مَا وَعَدَنَ اللَّهُ رَسُولُهُ. They said, this is exactly what Allah and His Messenger have promised us. وَصَدَقَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. That Allah and His Messenger have spoken the truth, and it only increased them in their faith and in their submission. Which means what? One group of people had negative assumptions about Allah. And so when they saw the enemy coming, they were like, yep, sure enough, we thought bad about God, bad is about to happen to us. And the other group had good thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they understood God and His Messenger told us people would come to attack us. He said that the whole world is going to unite to attack us, and that's what they're coming to do. So they're like, look, it's actually increased them in faith. The prophecy of Muhammad ﷺ is coming true. Another incident in the Battle of Uhud, Allah talks about when the believers initially were winning, and then they began to lose in the Battle of Uhud. Allah tells us what happened. ثُمَّ أَنزَلَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ الْغَمِّ أَمَنَةً نُعَاسًا يَغْشَى طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ. That after they were losing this battle, right, and it was like a very difficult time, Allah said, then He caused the believers to feel drowsy, and they took like a power nap. You know, if you're like sitting in like a lecture, like some of you right now, taking that little 10-second power nap, right? And Allah says they took this tiny power nap, and it gave them so much, and it refreshed them to a very high level. Then He says, وَطَائِفَةً قَدْ أَهَمَّتْهُمْ أَنفُسُهُمْ يَظُنُّونَ بِاللَّهِ غَيْرَ الْحَقِّ ظَنَّ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ. He goes, but there was another group of people. And this group of people were also the hypocrites and those weak in faith, who started to have a lot of anxious thoughts in their hearts. They began to have negative thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, thoughts of ignorance. And why is this? Again, they wanted the spoils of war. They went out to war for booty, right? They went out for wealth, right? And when now they're losing in the battle, right? Now they start to have all these terrible thoughts. That's it, we're dead, Allah's going to destroy us, like Allah has lied to us, right? And this theme comes up over and over again. This is why 3 times in the Quran Allah says, مَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. 3 times. مَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. They have not understood Allah the way He's meant to be understood. They have not estimated Allah in His true estimation. And that's the entire message of the Quran, and almost the entire message of the Seerah. So much of it is, if you know who Allah is, it is easy to obey Him. It is easy to submit to Him, because you know. I give this example again, like if you're an investor, right, and anyone has like a retirement account, right, and you trust the CEO of a company, you have deep trust in him. You know, some days the stock is going to be down, some days the stock is going to be up. But you know, when you have deep trust, right, in that CEO, you're like, you know what, I'm not going to get caught up in these blips. I know long term is going up, right? If you have no faith in the CEO, you're like, when the stock drops, you're going to have like a heart attack, right? Now, this is of course at the human level. Everything happens to me and you is not going to be ideal in our understanding of reality. But when you understand that nothing happens without Allah's will, and that Allah, everything He does it with a wisdom, and He does it to bring you benefit. Even the things that you don't want, He will drag you to paradise with things that you like, please Allah, don't give me this, right? And that's what Allah said in the Quran, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. Allah says He has written upon you to fighting, and even though it is something detested by you. No one wants to get up and go to war. Most people don't. I'd rather sit back and relax. I'd rather hang out with my family. I'd rather just be safe and secure. But Allah says, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Perhaps you don't like something and it's good for you. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. Perhaps you love something and it's bad for you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. This is the kicker. If you can internalize, Allah knows and you do not know. Oh Allah, I don't know what's good for me. I genuinely don't. And anyone now who reads like anything to do with modern science, science tells you one day this is good for you, the next day science tells you that it's bad for you, right? And I'm a scientist, this is what I do, right? Constantly you see this. You know what? A little bit of alcohol is good for you, then they say, no, actually no, alcohol is good for you, right? And in a study, it's just constantly, don't co-sleep with your kids, you're gonna kill them. Then they find out, actually there's nothing wrong with co-sleeping, just don't do alcohol, right? Don't drink while you're sleeping, right? Like, it's like science is just up and down, up and down, up and down, right? There's no truth in any of this stuff, right? But when a believer says, you know what? The only infinite truth is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in His Messenger, it's so easy then, and Allah, He's doing this for my well-being, He cares for me, He knows what's going to make us start. Allah ya'lamu man khalaq. Does the one who created not know? What, all the human beings know how we should live? And Allah doesn't know how we should live? Right? This is what Allah says. وَهُوَ لَطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. He is the most kind and He's the most knowledgeable. When you internalize that, it becomes very easy. So you know what, Allah? I trust that you know how I should live better than I know how I should live. So even though I want to do this and it's in my desire and my nafs, I'm not going to do it because I know it's not good for me and I know my sweetness isn't doing the other things. Ramadan is a good example, and I'll end with this. Are there any hadith that talk about if you don't fast Ramadan, you go to hell? Are there any hadith that say if you don't go to Taraweeh, right, then you get punished, right? But strangely, Ramadan is a time of the year that Muslims are more religious than any other time. What motivated the Muslims? Was it a threat of punishment, or was it reward and maybe even sweetness that you know? It was something internal. You're like, God didn't say I'm going to get punished if I don't do this. He's promised me tremendous reward, and I enjoy it. Like, Taraweeh is voluntary. And people, the masjid's packed, right? It's packed. You say, what? The human beings, and you tell a non-Muslim, when you tell them, they're like shocked. Okay, you get up at 4 in the morning, you eat breakfast, hardly sleep, you don't eat and drink all day long, and then you go to the mosque for 2 hours. What's wrong with you, right? And then Muslims are like so sad. Like Ramadan comes to an end. At the university, one of the other professors, it's like, oh, congratulations, Ramadan's over. Aren't you? You're so lucky now, right? And I was like, no, we missed Ramadan. Like, what? You missed Ramadan? Like, they can't understand that once you've tasted Allah's guidance, that you'd never want to go back to this. And that's the last hadith I'll mention. The Prophet said, ثَلَاثٌ مَنْ كُنَّ فِيهِ وَجَدَ حَلَاوَةَ الْإِيمَانِ. He said, 3 things, if you possess, you will taste the sweetness of faith. And all 3 of them are emotions. He said, أَن يُحِبُّ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ أَكْثَرُ أَحَبُّ إِلَيْكَ مِمَّا سِوَاهُمَا. That you love Allah and His Messenger more than you love anything else in this life. وَأَن يُحِبُّ الْعَبْدَ وَلَا يُحِبُّ الْعَبْدَ إِلَّا لِلَّهِ. That you don't love another person except for the sake of Allah. وَأَن يَكْرَهَ أَن يَعُودَ فِي الْكُفْرِ كَمَا يَكْرَهَ أَن يُقْذَفَ فِي النَّارِ. That you would hate to return to disbelief the way you hate to be thrown in the hellfire. It's fascinating. The Prophet is telling you, if you want sweetness of faith, it's not in more knowledge, right? It's not in more prayers, right? It's in an emotion. Can you develop the emotion of loving Allah and His Messenger, loving your brother and sister for the sake of Allah, and hating and despising disbelief? And that's difficult because the entire world today, all of marketing, sells to you and markets and glamorizes sin. And you're watching the playoffs, or you're watching a TV show, and what happens? A commercial comes, and people are drinking alcohol in the commercial, and they're laughing and they're joking. Oh, it looks like it's so much fun, right? Or someone is eating, a big, bacon cheeseburger, right? And it looks like it's dripping and it looks so delicious, right? Everything is about selling to you how glorious actually disobedience is, right? And we are being exposed to this. And so our youth are like, I wish I could have those things. And the Prophet is saying, if you want the sweetness of faith, you need to despise those things. And learning to despise them is a process, right? It is not easy, and maybe that's a talk for another day. But I just want us to take that home. It's like, we want sweetness of ibadah, we want to submit, work on your emotions with Allah and His Messenger and your faith. And if you work on that, everything else becomes so much easier. When you love something, it's easy. Anyone here go to the gym regularly? Anyone? Raise your hand if you go to the gym, right? Do you like going to the gym? Right? Who doesn't go to the gym? Some of you? I'm going to assume you don't like going to the gym. The difference between going to the gym and not going to the gym is essentially, and those who start, the first time you go to the gym, it is difficult. It is painful. And actually, literally, your muscles are tearing when you're lifting weights. That's what's happening, right? And you sweat, and you're like, man, this is just brutal. And after you go for a while, you love it, and you can't stop. You can't stop. Like, you feel nasty when you don't go and you work out, right? Or another example is when you eat certain foods. So when you were kids, some of you probably loved fast food. Now many of you may not touch that fast food, right? And you like salads, right? And some of you like healthy food. And your kids look at you like, are you crazy? Right? What is the difference here? You tasted it at first, it was difficult, but you knew it was good for you. And as you complied with what was the right thing to do, it got easier to do. As it got easier to do, it actually became more enjoyable, and now you love doing it, no one has to tell you to do it. And this is what Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned. He goes, it's a staircase of ibadah and love. The first level is compliance. The second level is its ease. The third level is its sweetness. But you've got to start somewhere. Just start complying, and then you'll find that it gets easier, and then you'll find that it gets sweeter. This is why one scholar, he said, I had to pray Qiyamul Layl for 20 years before I tasted the sweetness for the next 20 years, right? Things are not given to you on a silver platter, right? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to see Him in the most beautiful way. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to raise our kids in a way that demonstrates the majesty and the glory and the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we ask Allah, the way He's gathered us here today, to gather us in the highest gardens of paradise with the prophets and the righteous and the martyrs. Wa akhiru da'wana, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Dr. Uthman. MashaAllah, he's a full-time for the Yaqeen Institute, and he's actually an instructor with the UCI. He was an imam also up in Southern California. May Allah reward him. Down to earth doctor, subhanAllah. Keep him in your dua. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الله أكبر الله